a Rabbinic Anthology selected with an introduction by C.G. Montefiore and H.Loewe. We are in our second program for our introduction by H.Loewe. The law which Moses commanded is an inheritance, O congregation of Jacob. In some sense, we all accept a Mosaic law. Blessed be he who, in his holiness, gave the Torah to his people Israel. Will be found both in the Liberal Per Book, page 335, and in Singer, page 143. On this cardinal point, there is no ambiguity. In both rights, the wording of the declaration is the same. Yes, in some sense, here differences of interpretation and belief make themselves manifest. These are, generally speaking, concerned with three issues, for the adequate consideration of which space is here lacking. A bare outline alone can here be given. These issues are: 1. The relation of the Pentateuch in its textus receptus to the Sinaitic revelation. 2. The scope of revelation and its content. 3. The immutability of revelation. The first point is, briefly stated, the question of biblical criticism. If we still retain the outlook and phraseology of the Colenso era, then no progress is possible. But we surely are not content to repeat these parrot cries automatically and without examining their validity, for these slogans are almost a century old. Slogans are productive of controversy alone, and are destructive alike of faith and of scholarship. The liberals of old would maintain that the Orthodox were tied to literal inspiration. The Orthodox of old would accuse the liberals of repudiating Moses' law in toto. Both charges are unreal. Both may be neglected. If one opens at random a page of Kennicott's Hebrew Bible, any verse which may be examined will be found to contain variants. The Hebrew Bibles do not agree. No two examples necessarily tally word for word. It is true that the overwhelming majority of these variants can be regarded as of minor critical importance, but a principle is at stake. Now, with the variants of Al-Quran, you don't run into any contradictions of any sort. And what they call the New Testament has even more variants. 10,000. Over 10,000 variants of the Greek New Testament. The doctrine of literal inspiration is mechanical. It stands or falls by an absolutely uniform text. If the manuscripts of the Textus Receptus differ in one single iota, the doctrine is irreparably shattered, which, in that case, was the reading revealed to Moses and recorded by him in the 5th century. Elias Levita demonstrated that the vowel points were a post-Talmudic invention. In the Talmud, they are neither mentioned nor implied. On the contrary, their non-existence is evident. Our earliest dated Hebrew Bible goes back to the year 916 of the Common Era. Kennicott's collected variants, therefore, are based on relatively late codices. Well, if you go back, you find other codices, and, well, codice is the wrong word, but you find fragments of text going back even to the times of the prophets, but none of the books are contemporary with them. If it's of Samuel, it's long after Samuel. If it's of Moses, it's centuries after Moses. Even after the discovery of printing, errors crept into the text and were perpetuated. 1 Samuel 17:34 is an example. The work of the Masoretes, the differences between Ben Asher and Ben Naphtali, can be regarded as carrying the testimony to textual variation into earlier centuries. It is obvious that we cannot talk of literal inspiration, that is to say, we are not in a position to guarantee that the vowels and consonants in every case mechanically represent the law as revealed to Moses. Well, it represents, but it doesn't carry on in a way that you can point at any particular thing and say, oh, this is the thing. Moreover, we can bear in mind that the stichometry of the Talmudic times does not tally with that to be found in our text. Thus, in Qed 30a, an anonymous Baraita states, the Pentateuch has 8,888 verses, the Psalter 8 more, Chronicles 8 less. Some texts read 5,888, 5,896, 5,880. All these figures differ from the Masoretic totals. L. Goldschmidt points out that the suggestion that Pentateuch, Psalter, and Chronicles have substantially the same number of verses is quite unintelligible on the basis of our figures, for our Psalter is about half and Chronicles about a quarter of the number of verses in the Pentateuch. In discussing the Baraita, the statement is made that exact knowledge of the numbers, verses, no longer existed. It is clear that various systems prevailed, each with different divisions and combinations, and no doubt additions and omissions. See L. Loewe, Masoretic Studies, JQR, Old Series, Volume 9, 1897, page 122, 144, and 471 to 490. See also his earlier articles. That the number of words and the divisions of verses do not always, if at all, correspond with our present numbers and divisions. That the Qara, or read text, is often the only possible one. We cannot fall back even upon verbal inspiration. We notice that the place of certain verses, Joshua 21:35, is uncertain, as the Masoretic note testifies, and that the Masoretic accents imply that others are incomplete. Numbers 25:19, Genesis 35:22. We have, moreover, Talmudic evidence of textual variants afforded by the puncta extraordinaria, for example, Genesis 33:4 and elsewhere, where the dots denote the conflation of two readings. And by the tradition that the manuscripts in the temple contain variants. For example, Ma'an in Deuteronomy 33:27. See the note for number 39 when we get to that. After the introduction. Biblical citations in the Talmud and Midrash, and also in medieval commentators and writers, differ from our text. Variety of reading in the versions is a well-known fact. Not all the Septuagint variants are errors. Not all the Samaritan variants are deliberate changes. If then we may no longer speak either of literal or of verbal inspiration, we may conscientiously accept the 8th article of the Maimonidean Creed, which declares the whole of the Torah, which is in our possession, is that which was given to Moses. I think we can justifiably do so. Maimonides was not interested in textual problems, but with spiritual values. What he wished to stress was the equal importance of all parts of the Pentateuch. There is no difference between verses like, and the sons of Ham were Cush and Mizraim, Genesis 10:6, and the Decalogue are the Shema. Each has a lesson to teach. It may be one of historical incident, or it may be one of spiritual injunctions. Well, if it's religion, you're supposed to be able to have both at the same time, or the spiritual importance in whichever type of worldly thing that it combines with. We can learn from both, not least from the frank description of the frailties of heroes and the sins of the wicked, for our conscience tells us which are recorded for our imitation and which for our avoidance. They are all equally of divine origin and all belong to the Torah. How Maimonides would have dealt with critical questions does not concern us. We cannot speculate how Newton would have dealt with the quantum theory. We can be certain that neither the one nor the other would have shirked investigation. Maimonides was fearless. His principles, if not his results, abide, but we must carry them further. It seems to me irrelevant here to discuss how much or how little of the Pentateuch is Mosaic, how much Mosaic material was transmitted orally, how much is editorial. I shall say a brief word about this latter. I'm here concerned with the so-called creed and its declaration of belief in a revelation to Moses, a declaration which, as has been seen, is to be found also in the liberal prayer book. And if the wording of the creed is too dogmatic for our liking, we must remember that it does not emanate from Maimonides himself. It is based on his commentary on the Mishnah. It has become popular as a convenient formula, but the so-called creed has never been adopted practically by any Jewish authority as a test of faith. See Abraham's page CIV footnote. We can be fairly safe in asserting that had the question of biblical criticism presented itself to Maimonides, he would have treated it as rationally and as sympathetically as he treated the question of the eternity of matter. But if we still feel unhappy about Maimonides, we can turn to his predecessor, Abraham ibn Ezra, who, as so unimpeachably orthodox a scholar as Bakker states, held the origin of the Pentateuch was Mosaic. Though it received minor additions in latter times, he also regarded Isaiah 11 to 66 as not being Isaiah's work. Reinterpretation is justifiable with ancient formulas that possess a value that is both intrinsic and historic, and of which certain parts seem obsolete. The parts must not outweigh the whole. Thus, Christians do not scruple to repeat the Apostles' Creed, containing the words, I believe in the reinsurance of the body. Reinterpretation is the price we pay for a historic religion. It is the safeguard against spiritual and intellectual stagnation, for it implies constant watchfulness in teaching and alertness in thought, but it must not be overdone. We cannot say white with our lips and mean black in our hearts. Reinterpretation has its limits. If we are prepared to accept the term intrinsic interpretation, intrinsic inspiration, in place of literal or verbal inspiration, we shall find no antagonism between reason and revelation. The oft-cited saying, "What is true history is true religion," holds good. This wise remark of Professor S.A. Cook is attributed by him to Dean Stanley, and by him said to be adapted from Scotus Erigena. See Professor Cook's inaugural lecture, "The Place of the Old Testament in Modern Research," Cambridge, 1932, page 4. We begin with a Torah revealed to Moses, and as the Perek continues, handed down through Joshua to the elders and prophets. The transmission was in human hands, for the revealed Torah belongs to us and our children. Well, you think God would have chose prophets who could have transmitted it correctly, so let's not blame the failure of transmission on the prophets. And historically, this is a quote from Deuteronomy 29:29, but yeah, historically we can say that all these books were pseudo-epigraphical, decades or centuries later than the particular prophets. So it was not given into the hands of angels, but the flesh and blood. Flesh and blood is fallible, and it is this fallibility that produced varied forms of tradition during the troublous periods of the conquest and the monarchy. Tradition faltered, sometimes texts were lost. There can be no holier tradition in Israel than that of the Passover, yet it was forgotten from the days of the judges until it was reinstituted by Josiah. Now, I don't always know from the English how we're supposed to say the Aramaic, or Hebrew as people call it. Yitzchak is close to Ezekiel, but you would never guess that. The book of the law itself, however we interpret the phrase, was lost until it was recovered by Hilkiah. Small wonder then that when Ezra and his followers restored the crown to its pristine glory, Judaism and Christianity, Volume 2, page 9, Volume 1, page 111, they were faced with divergences. Such is the tale which the scriptures themselves have to tell. It is so widely different from the verdict of scholars today. Well, is it so widely different? Moreover, questions of date call for very serious consideration, and theories will need readjustment. Because theories are supposed to process the facts. So, if new facts come, on the one hand, the evidence of archaeology must not be abused for party purposes. We have seen what false conclusions in favor of fundamentalism have been drawn from the wonderful discovery of the Lachish letters. These have been proclaimed as confirming the Bible and confuting the critics that they do, in certain respects, conform to rather than confirm. The Bible narrative is true. That they confute the critics is false. Similar newspaper slogans accompanied the finding of the Moabite stone and the Siloam inscription. There are still videos being made about that stuff, trying to say, the Muslims are afraid that people are going to find this out exist. It's like, no, they're not. On the other hand, we have traveled a long distance from the Graf Wellhausen era, which relegated so much to a late epoch. Two examples will make this clear. Among the Elephantine papyri, there is a rescript of Darius II, which permits his Jewish soldiers to keep the Passover and seal up their leaven. Yet this custom has usually been regarded as rabbinic. Again, many of the Rosh Hashanah terms relating to sacrifice and ritual occur in the part of the Hebrew Bible assigned to the P code on the surest grounds. Facts of this nature will have to be reckoned with. The documentary hypothesis may be modified, as in Vols and Ryder are attempting to do. That it will be swept away, as Jacob R. Marston suggests, is unlikely in the extreme. Now, a lot you can explain through the tablets of Epla and Elam, but that doesn't refute that there could have been prophets later in those cultures. Even if you do show that through tradition included some things aside from that. It is scarcely needful to issue a caveat against giving a blank check to all that goes by the name of modern scholarship. Not everyone who uses the name is entitled to do so. Schechter once spoke of certain aspects of biblical criticism as the higher anti-Semitism. Well, let's not confuse criticism of Jews or Judaism, or more commonly Zionists or particular Jews, with anti-Semitism, because Jews are usually not Semitic. 97.5% of Israeli Jews are not Semitic, but 40% of Iranians are, and a higher percentage of every other surrounding people of Israel. So, the remark is sometimes justified, for certain well-known tendencies are both destructive of the idea of revelation in general, and in particular are also intended to demonstrate that no ethical good can come out of Israel. Well, it wasn't till the modern times till Christians considered consent of either a male or a female required for marriage, as, connecting it to religious grounds, right? We sometimes hear too much of the terms monolatry, henotheism. We sometimes read commentaries and textbooks which seek to show that almost all religious thought for the time of Jesus was narrow and tribal. But with aberrations, we are not concerned. Moreover, current biblical scholarship has succeeded from the ultra-radicalism of the 80s. 1880s is when Zionism appeared, and the founders of Zionism pointed out this idea that, the whole thing was to infiltrate and replace Judaism and Christianity. So it was a secular movement, but, and also those lies about 6 million people killed. 1886 is one year that I found that they were being said. Turned out not to be true. The real Holocaust of the World War II, they actually have numbers of everybody, and the Jews in particular, which did happen to be the majority. But most people, it turns out, weren't killed just because they were Jews. But that's an entirely different issue. The pendulum has swung towards the center, not to the extreme opposite. Central facts remain, but with important modifications. There are few today who would deny that Moses existed and that he was a recipient of revelation in some form. The case which we would set out is simply that our attitude towards Holy Scripture must be based on the acceptance of revelation and be guided by the teachings of history and archaeology, for these two have been vouchsafed to us by revelation. Treatment of this kind will be found in Mr. Montefiore's recent introduction to the Hebrew Bible, a book which is of great value to every Jew, irrespective of the party to which he belongs. Now, if it's about belonging to a party or school or something, it's all conservative. It is, as well, in this connection, to recall his Hibbert lectures on much the same topic, with the bulk of which Schuster would have found himself in agreement. The foregoing arguments may therefore thus be summarized. On the basic fact, though not on the extent of revelation, there is no difference between liberal and Orthodox Jews. Both accept a Mosaic Torah. Both admit that in the course of human transmission, variants have entered the text. Where there is divergence is in the scope of the documentary hypothesis, in the priority of certain prophetical teaching over Mosaic, in the role conceded to variation, and in the extent of editorial influence. This divergence is not absolute. It is personal and subjective. It may be enormous. It may be slight. But in any case, it is a divergence of degree, not of principle. Therefore, though it may sunder individuals, it is not necessarily a line of demarcation between the two parties, which automatically renders any intercourse impossible. Secondly, there is the scope of revelation and its content. Here again, we find no clear boundary between liberal and orthodox bodies, between individuals. Such a dividing line may often be found throughout Jewish history. The emphasis laid on the greatness of the Torah is unquestionable, but the attitude towards the rest of the Bible was not always uniform. On the one hand, there were periods when it was regarded as heretical to base authority for religious practice on the prophetical books and the hagiographa, see page CIV. On the other hand, at times, those who maintain that prophets and hagiographa were not Torah were called sinners of Israel. Tan Re'eh 1, 318a. For whoever busies himself in Torah and fulfills it is accounted as though he had received it on Sinai. Now for the stress laid on the speaking prophets, for example, Elijah, on the order of service laid down in Ta'an 2:4, for the stress on the written prophets and their association with Torah, see the benedictions to the Haftarah. There's that transliterations kind of throw you off when there's two T's, right? CPB, page 148, 151, which may go back to the temple days. If they are the blessings used by the high priest and the contemporary and to the contemporary synagogue, as is possibly suggested by Yoma 70a, it is clear that since Judaism contains certain post-Mosaic tenets which were derived from the prophets, the absolute and permanent supremacy of the law of Moses over the rest of the Bible needs some qualification. Thus, even Meg 14a, which declares categorically that the prophets added nothing to the law of Moses, makes an exception with regard to the Megillah. Abraham's page CCV. As will be seen, Judaism regards the Torah as capable of expansion. Hence, the Pentateuch possesses what may be termed a potential supremacy, since it is the source of later development, see 432, 433. Some liberals may prefer to stress the development rather than the source. This, again, is a matter rather of subjective decision than a principle, as is somewhat naively stated in Ned 22b. The prophetical books and hagiographa would not have been needed had Israel not sinned. The Hexateuch would have sufficed. Here already we see the germ of this idea of potential supremacy. Even the Pentateuch itself needs the book of Joshua to be complete. The terms development and source that have just been used need explanation. In one sense, Amos, Hosea, and Isaiah precede the law. In another sense, the law precedes them. If we are concerned with the date of redaction, no doubt priority belongs to these prophets, but if we mean certain oral and possibly written traditions which underlie the codified law, then it is at least arguable that these have precedence, and it is these that we mean when we speak of a Mosaic revelation. The interrelation of the two traditions, law and prophets, is extremely significant. The connection between Deuteronomy and Jeremiah is a problem in point. Both source and development are indispensable. As we have just said, the Hexateuch rounds off the Pentateuch. Joshua and Moses are linked. This idea has two implications. It binds the new to the old, investing the new with the authority of the old, but it also prevents the old from remaining static and checking development. It proclaims a line of continuity. The path of progress is straight. The tree of tradition is neither barren nor productive of strange fruit. Thus, on the one hand, we read all that the prophets are destined to prophesy, they received at Sinai. For it says that the divine covenant was made both with him who is here, standing with us today, Deuteronomy 29:14, AV 15, and as the verse continues, also with him that is not here with us today, that is to say, with those already in existence and with those destined to be created, the souls that were to be born in the future. Tan Yitro 11, folio 124a. The passage continues to demonstrate this in detail by taking Isaiah and Malachi as examples. In a sense, Isaiah precedes the Torah, for Isaiah said, "At the hour when the Torah was given, I received this prophecy." Words left out. Till this moment, I did not receive the command to utter it. And this applies not alone to the prophets, but also to all the sages who will arise in the future. For immediately after the Decalogue, we read Deuteronomy 5:22. These words did God speak to all your congregation. And on the other hand, we read also in the Tanhuma Wa Yelek 1, folio 338b, that this tradition will take diverse forms, since the minds of men and consequently their ideas of God are diverse. But so long as their minds are directed honestly to God, his inspiration will mold their several ideas. All will be produced by the outpouring of his Spirit. There will be no heresy or schism, no heterodoxy, no orthodoxy. The words of the wise are like nails firmly implanted, all given by one shepherd. Ecclesiastes 12:11. This means that though some rabbis declare unclean and some clean, though some forbid and some permit, all draw their authority from Moses, who derived it from the Almighty. See 436. This second issue, however, cannot be separated from the third mentioned above. Page LXII, i.e. the immutability of the Torah. On page 406 of the Liberal Prayer Book, the editors deemed it necessary to add a footnote to the 9th verse of Yigdal. The verse reads, God will never alter nor change his law to everlasting for any other. The note states, his law is here taken in a larger sense than it has in the original. It may be questioned whether the footnote was needed. It may be that the original was intended to repudiate the specifically Christian contention that the old dispensation was to be replaced by the new one, not something that they put in the mouth of Jesus, actually. Plahrose is to refurbish, to restore, to fulfill. Fulfill doesn't mean that no one else has to do it. It's to bring back the actual law, not the liberal, not the conservative, but what came through the prophets. So it's not a new testament. If so, that repudiation would be endorsed by liberal, no less than by Orthodox Jews, by medieval, no less than by modern. In that case, no note is needed. That his law meant that the Torah was static forever and incapable of development is impossible. That his law may mean the universal law of God, natural as well as ethical, is, I believe, possible, if not indeed probable. For the 19th Psalm, which proclaims the unity of the law of nature and the Torah, is significantly selected in the Sephardic rite to be the first daily psalm. The Ashkenazim reserve it in the same place in the liturgy, page 20. For Sabbaths and festivals, both rites introduce the Shema by passages of poetic imagery, page 37, 39, 129, and 128, XLII to XLVIII, CXXIII, CXLIII, footnote, CXLV, in which the luminaries are represented as joining man in a combined praise of God. The universal law of nature and the Torah are each equally God's. See 563. Because remember, when we get to our main text, we have, I don't know how many. Okay, there was a 1400 somewhere. 16, well, we'll find out later, right? This extended meaning of the phrase, God's law, may well have been the thought underlying the verse in Yigdal, but whether this be so or not, we Orthodox and liberals alike do so interpret it. In my opinion, the dogmatic has of the note should be mitigated by a qualification such as may have had, then the note may usefully serve as a source of devotion. Judaism, whether Orthodox or liberal, old or modern, teaches that God's law is universal as well as immutable. What is true in nature is true in religion. What is false in science cannot be true in religion. Truth is one and indivisible. God is bound by his own laws. See 454, 455. It is indeed ironical to note that the unity of the 19th Psalm has been impugned by some people for the very reason that it asserts first God's supremacy alike in the natural and in the religious spheres, and secondly the congruence of those spheres. The sun, in going forth on its daily round, is fulfilling Torah, as is a human being who worships God, as much as is a Jew when he performs the commandments, which are pure and enlightening to the eyes. Psalm 19:8. This, the central element in the angelology of the blessing before the Shema, PB, page 38, occurs again in Nehemiah's prayer and is likewise introduced in the morning service on every day in the year. PB, page 34. And yet, there is the prayer book they're mentioning, right? And yet there is in Judaism a basic principle of the most potent mutability, the doctrine of progress. God's Torah is immutable, be it manifested in the movements of the heavens or in the ethics given to men. The standards of love, justice, and truth are permanent and unchangeable. It is in the operation of the qualities among human beings and by human beings that development is possible, that progress becomes one of God's most cherished promises to man. God gave man reasoning powers capable of expansion as well as Torah. Without reason, man cannot appreciate Torah. See 268. Without Torah, man cannot use his reason rightly. See Abbath 321, prayer book, page 194. The two ideas are mutually complementary and inseparable. As reason grows, the appreciation of Torah grows. The Torah constantly reveals itself anew. Fresh with the mornings, great is thy truth. God's word is not an antiquated diatagma, but one which is ever new, which men run to read. Sephra Duter wa Ethanon, or Ethanon, 33, folio 74a. In other words, the doctrine of the Messiah, or the belief in the ultimate improvement of the human race, is a correlative to the doctrine of an immutable Torah. The Torah is your life, and like life, it grows. If there are no standards, or if the standards shift, no progress is possible. How can mankind improve if, 5,000 years hence, good and evil will have interchanged their meanings? What, on the other hand, is the value of a remote, abstract idea of goodness preserved in heaven and unattainable by man, unless man reaches out to attain it, and unless man knows that he can, in the end, attain it, and that every effort he makes brings him nearer to it? What, finally, can a static idea of goodness achieve that is anchored to one generation? It is because the Torah contains the germs of expansion, see 426 to 429, that it can be termed both immutable and progressive. It is self-sufficing. Eve was the mother of all living. Her womb contained the seed of all future humanity. Similarly, the Torah possesses autarky, for it is ever developing. So Leibniz presents an infinite system of perfectly distinct, though parallel developments, which, on their mental side, assume the aspect of a scale, not through any mutual action, but solely through the determination of the deity. Encyclopedia Britannica, 11th edition, volume 10, page 27. The Torah extends its influence as needs arise to correspond with human development, wants, and comprehension. It develops new phrases, immanent in its essence, so God fulfills himself in many ways. Polymeron, Paul Eros, Kai Palatrapos. Throughout Jewish history, these two elements have been visible in harmonious equipoise. On the one hand, Moses appealed to his brethren in the name of the God of their fathers, just as Jacob, at a moment of particular solemnity, testified by him whom his father Isaac revered, so too Elijah at the supreme crisis invokes the ancestral God. But when the crisis was past and the victory won, a second element makes its appearance. Now, O Lord, take away my life, for I am no better than my fathers. Life without progress is worthless. Unless we are better than our fathers, why should we struggle? What have we achieved? Elijah's great utterance has had incalculable effect. He becomes the harbinger of the Messiah. See number 664. The type of progress, the same Elijah who overthrew Baal worship and brought his people back to the God of their fathers. Malachi ends his prophecy with a climax of hope, God's assurance that he would send Elijah the prophet to turn the hearts of children to fathers and the hearts of fathers to children. In other words, until the Messiah come, the two forces of youth and age, tradition and progress, experience and venture, orthodoxy and liberalism will continue in equipoise, nay, in apparent conflict. He will reconcile them, for it is only in the end that the truth will become manifest. It needs infinity for parallel lines to converge. Every conflict that is in the name of heaven is designed to endure, for God's world would be the poorer, would be incomplete if one of the two forces were spent. And so, on Sabbath night, when we usher in the working days, we repeat Malachi's promise, see Gaster Volume 1, page 139, and we pray for the gift of discrimination so that we can learn to judge between the false and the true, whether it be in the traditions of the past or in the innovations which progress would essay. Revelation, as it seems to the present writer, is something infinitely more magnificent and mysterious than the mechanical system which the doctrine of literal inspiration would make of it. A free Torah connotes free will. See, I have set before you this day life and death, good and evil, and thou shalt choose life. There is a tremendous significance in the wording of the benedictions spoken when commandments ordained by rabbinic authority are fulfilled, just as in the case of scriptural commandments. We thank God who hast sanctified us by thy commandments and commanded us to Abraham's page CCV, the rabbinic ordinances framed according to the needs of the day are as incumbent as the ordinances of the Torah. For according to their words shall ye do. Discussions and differences of opinion among the rabbis, the dialectics of Rabbah and Abaye, like the controversies of the Halites and the Shemaites, are these and these alike the words of the living God. See 436. No miracles are required, neither falling walls nor moving carob tree. See 890. Burnham wood need not come to Dunsinane. The Torah is with us. We decide the law. Well, we are able to make our own conclusions of what the law is for us. But though we have free will, there's yet a providence that shapes our ends and guides our choice. We decide the law not by caprice. In this fact, it seems to me, lies the wonder of revelation and the secret of free will. If we review the course of history from the Peckin man onward, we note how the human race has climbed upward slowly, painfully, yet progressively. Certain things have dropped off, even as millenniums before the Peckin man, our tails, it is said, atrophied into appendices, to be a worry to the patient and a source of income to the surgeon. Mankind has improved. No moral shudder seems to have passed over decent society. In Rome, when Crassus crucified 6,000 slaves along the Appian Way. Europe was not horrified at the enormity of the Genghis Khan's massacres. It merely dreaded his advent westward. Yet today, Mussolini's cruelties in Abyssinia do harrow the consciences of men and women, even though these consciences seem somewhat sluggish. And if we may contrast the more vigorous days when Gladstone roused England against Turkish atrocities, and remember the Armenian genocide, the Zionist involvement with that, and that the genocide that ended in 135 in the establishment of Palestine being made official in 1948 to start it up again. But then again, it was going on unofficially in different parts of the Middle East prior. People were being killed in Egypt and Palestine before that. Well, particularly Palestine, but the Egyptian government, except for a brief period in the 21st century, has pretty much been under Zionist rule, and a lot of the tortures and killings and stuff have been a result of that. Now, it might so easily have been different. Things might just as well have gone the other way. If you look at Israel alone, the change is amazing. Already in the dim past, the high places, the human sacrifices, the sacred prostitutions disappeared. They might have endured the horrors of early days, when each man did as was right in his own eyes ceased. Gradually, polygamy passed away, and fornication and adultery rose greatly, and venereal disease rose greatly, and women not being taken care of rose greatly. Gradually, certain commands, such as the extermination of witches and sorcerers, became obsolete. Well, there's plenty of people who want to restore those aspects of Judaism and Christianity that teach that intolerance. The crudities of ancient warfare became mitigated, and war itself restricted. The private vendetta, which was the only method of upholding justice in lawless days, was circumscribed. The lex talionis was a step forward in civilization. The unbounded power of the avenger was curbed, and the innocent homicide given a chance of escape. They mean somebody who did not intend things to get that far. When settled and central justice was established, the vendetta itself was abolished. The lex talionis gave place to compensation. The change of the name Azazel to Azazel marks the suppression of demon worship. Moloch, Melech Taus, Shaitan, Gnog Nog, and the substitution of a symbolic act of public atonement, and so on. Why did all this happen? Why did human society choose these lines? Why did not the evil that men do live after them? Was it sheer accident? Man has had the choice. Why has he chosen life? For slow though his upward progress may have been, the stages through which he has passed, the shreds which he has discarded, are plainly visible. That he has chosen life, we cannot deny. The unavoidable answer seems to be revelation. Revelation is the silent, imperceptible manifestation of God in history. It is the still small voice. It is the inevitableness, the regularity of nature, not the whirlwind or earthquake, but the ordinary movements of the heavens, the successions of harvests. God reveals himself by the fact that while man has freedom to choose evil, yet he has in fact chosen good. though he knew not that his choice was guided. Revelation, then, is the denial of chance. Almighty God, through his Shekinah, influences man, who may even be unconscious of the spirit that is moving him. The elders of Israel saw God as they ate and drank, seemingly unmindful of his presence. He made his will known to Moses and the prophets. He caused men to abandon this and to lay hold of that. The nature festivals gained historical motifs and spiritual associations. In primitive times, lads and girls danced in the vineyards on the 10th of Tishri, see 1132. In historical times, the day became the holiest in the year when a united people sought national and personal atonement from God. The creedal paragraphs, which morning and evening follow the Shema, enunciate this doctrine. The power of God is manifested by his works in the past, by his guidance exercised al-ha rishonim wa al-ha ahorinim. Why does he give Greek letters, not Hebrew, Aramaic letters to narrow down which words these are and help you pronounce it right? Over the men who have been and over the men who are. In other words, God in history is the definition of revelation. Without discussing fundamental issues, these few terse sentences can do no more than sketch the outlines of principles that need to be developed at great length. But this faint adumbration may be enough to show that, broadly speaking, on the question of revelation and its corollary, there is not an inherent incompatibility between orthodox and liberals, that is to say, between those adherents of these two aspects of Judaism who are prepared, sine ira et studio, to examine and to discuss the principles which they hold. Between fanatical extremists, there can be no approximation. Heresy hunters are unfortunately to be found in both camps. To such, this book will be an irritation and gnashing of teeth. This plea for an undenominational, comprehensive Judaism, which shall concentrate on realities and disregard labels, is nothing new. Maimonides did not call himself a liberal. Judah Halevi, a Zionist, or Joseph Caro, an upholder of orthodoxy. Each was content to be called Jew and entitle himself by the name of Israel. The same name, unadorned and unqualified, should suffice for us. Yisrael is sort of an equivalent for mujahideen. It is when we pass from the theory of revelation to its implications that divergences naturally arise. Since men are not vegetables, different conceptions of duty are inevitable. Mass-produced or enforced religion means unreal religion. In the heart of Marrano Judaism lived Torquemada, is that how you say the name? And compulsory baptism could not kill it. Under the stress of a great emergency, the issue may be plain. On Carmel, the alternative, God or Baal, could unite the populace in one cry. Baal was thought of as the son of El, so sort of what Christians say about Jesus. The Lord, he is God. But such emergencies are rare. Man does not live all his life at fever heat. Issues are not always plain. Life is made up of details and contradictions. Individuality must make itself felt. Plurimi per transibunt et multiplex eret sapientia The discipline of life takes many forms. The changes of time create ever-existing demands. Der Mensch wächst mit seinen höheren Zwecken. So it is that different conceptions of the best means of obeying the divine will, i.e. of interpreting the message of revelation, are multiplied. Here, the conflict between the old and the new is joined. When we contrast the practice of Judaism in Orthodox and in liberal congregations, we come to grips with the problem. But we must be extremely careful to avoid generalization. When we come to examine these two groups, even superficially, the inadequacy of the suggested division becomes patent, for within each group, while diversity exists, there is no absolute uniformity, though in each there is an underlying unity in the broadest sense. Heterogeneity is a symptom of vigorous vitality, of the prevalence of sincerity and independence in thought. These conditions can be observed among liberal and Orthodox equally. They are natural, since the Jewish unit is the congregation. History shows this. There have been temporary combinations, sometimes enduring for considerable periods, such as the Council of Four Lands, Wa'ad Arba Razlot, which existed in Poland from the 16th to the 18th century for certain specific purposes. Is the last word, aratzit. And by 18th century, of course, they mean of the Common Era. Now, one thing we should look at here is, because I've mentioned that, is how many numbers we actually have in this series of selections. Oh, and there's sort of some suffixes going on too. 1661. Excursus 1. Oh, the use excursus 2. Okay, I may have misunderstood what that referred to.